Welcome once again to The Lost Signals discusses games and gaming culture, a pretentious, philosophical, pedantic podcast where we focus on various aspects of video games as well as other issues and topics within gaming in general. Hello there, welcome back to Lost Signals, Games and Gaming Culture, and we are lost in time tonight. I am Scott Thurlow, here with Jonathan Ian Manzer.
I'm back from the future.
And Steve Minimosi.
And I'm a turtle in time.
We'll get to that. And as you may have gathered, we're going to talk about time-based games, which is sort of a broadish issue. So I sort of thought about it in two different directions, angles. Games that use time travel or like time manipulation, if you will, as a plot narrative device. And then games that sort of did it as a mechanic, like, you know, the bullet time thing, stuff like that. So, but certainly those aren't the only things. Those are just sort of the ones that I put on my list to start off with. So, what do you guys think? Like, are there more of one or the other, or which one's more interesting?
Well, I think it's far more interesting to and difficult to accurately do time travel.
Mm-hmm.
But when you pitched this idea, until actually when we started recording, I thought we were doing just time mechanics.
Okay, we'll do both for sure.
Yeah, I think that we can definitely delve. There's a bunch of games we can delve into. And I think that perhaps our most interesting conversation in this may come out of talking about how time mechanics work in games and how maybe they don't, and perhaps what could be on the horizon for this type of stuff. So let's do all that.
All right, that is fair. So I guess in a vague general tradition, I will sort of do a broad history. I would be remiss if I do not mention Chrono Trigger in this conversation. Because time travel, of course, that's a central part of the plot, and there's much of the overarching epic adventure involves that. Get a time machine, of course, even, and are changing the past timelines, time streams, etc. So I think we've all played and loved Chrono Trigger, correct?
Yeah. That is correct.
Yeah. So like that's sort of things I think that's probably one of the ones I would say like did it the best in terms of like using it as a plot point and leaning on it heavily, but integrating it quite well. You just mentioned one of my favorite games, Steve, Turtles in Time was fucking great. And just, you know, the Turtles go to a bunch of different time periods. And that was really fun. Maybe one of the funnest Turtles games.
Not to be confused with the terrible third Turtles movie where they go back in time.
Correct, yes. The game is awesome. The movie sucks.
See, interesting to compare the two.
Okay.
Because Turtles in Time is incidental. The fact
that's true, I guess.
Travel.
It's just like, hey, here's a stage and whatever, yeah.
But what I like about Chrono Trigger, not only is it important, narratively important, but remember the mechanic where you could get a chest in the past?
Yes.
And it was locked off.
Yes, I do remember that.
Or you can go through like the future to...
Yeah, I think you go to the future first and it's like upgrade it, and then you can go to the past and then get the regular version of it or whatever, yeah.
Exactly.
Yep.
So it had both the
That's true.
and the mechanics.
That's very much true. Probably why it's one of the best ones. But of course, also, I guess I'd be somewhat remiss if I didn't also mention Ocarina of Time and relatedly Majora's Mask. They both sort of use it. I guess Majora's Mask to a kind of bigger degree mechanically, I mean, even actually narratively, but both, right? Because you had 3 days till the world end, essentially, or the little mini-dimensional world that you are in.
Yeah.
So that was like, some quests can only complete on day 1 or like afternoon of day 2 or whatever, etc. Ocarina of Time is just you like going back and forth time periods, but still it was, you know, the Master Sword was the key to the time gate essentially. So you use that to solve puzzles as young Link and adult Link and affect changes like the windmill thing and all that.
Yeah.
So like those are the ones that sort of like did both. I have one on my list. You might like Data Tentacle, where you all get your 3 characters, I believe, 3 or 4. Yeah. I think it's 3 because you're in the past, present, and future, and the whole mechanic is, of course, like Maniac Mansion style puzzle solving, but shipping certain items and back and forth to advance the plot and get to the next stage. So, like, also one on here, like Steve-O, Lost Vikings. I want to say a word or two about that game because it is sweet.
I love Lost Vikings. It's so weird because it's not really a time. The only reason it's a time travel game because the original.
I mean, it's the
setup of the game is that Vikings go forward into the future and deal with all this crazy ass sci-fi shit.
Yeah.
But that game, I I know I've mentioned it a couple other times. It's one of my touchstone games. It's really good. Doesn't delve too deeply into the time travel thing, except for
that's true. It's sort of
the conversation that they have about how weird it is that they're in the future and like what all this weird shit that's going on as they're going through it. But yeah.
But sure, I mean, it does contain it. I do have Life is Strange, which I know you somewhat enjoyed in that mechanic of... I mean, we all played it, but I never actually got through it. Thought it was okay. Steve-O, I believe you hated it the most or disliked it the most. But still, the mechanic was...
Maybe I didn't give it enough of a chance, but...
But you as a character could, at varying times, go back a little bit in time to change. The problem is, which I think they don't know how... You can change small things, or even large, like save people or fail to save them. However, narratively, it couldn't keep up with that, so it just left to a binary choice at the end.
Yeah, fair enough. So you're saying like it was like a noble effort, but somewhat petered out in a sense towards the end. Yeah, fair enough. I have one. I don't think anybody remembers this game. If you're out there and you do, good on you. Darkest of Days. It was terrible. Like I don't think I even bought. I played like a demo of it, and I was like, this game sucks. I'm never buying it. But the setup was like you go to like important battles in history, so like the Battle of Little Bighorn and like Pearl Harbor, like shit like that. But the graphics were shitty, and like again, it was just a framework for like a very mediocre, done at best FPS. But they did ship you to like famous battles and shit in history. I think one that sort of conversely that was quite well done is Sands of Time, Prince of Persia, of course. Yeah. So like you rewound time, and like if you died, it's like it didn't happen that way, and you can rewind yourself.
That was one of the first ones. I think that game is really interesting and set the stage for. I think that came fairly shortly before Braid.
I was waiting. I know
we're going to talk about Braid, but like this is a very good game to talk about that during, because I think that the mechanics of that influenced those types of games, and especially Braid in terms of that. Sure. Like Braid went above and beyond in terms of the weird shit that it did, because they didn't like. Braid was this like crazy indie game that who's
Jonathan Blow.
Jonathan Blow spent like I'm sure thousands of hours on perfecting the way that the mechanics worked, and did a really great job at it. But that's a game that like you're probably not going to see its like again. Like in terms of what it did.
Sure, it was like sort of
specifically right. You'll see something that like changes the genre like that again. I'm sure, because that's the way that things go. But like that's a game that is on its own level type of thing.
Well, yes, I do agree with that, but I will mention, like, again, this is one that PSN gave out for free like a while back, but it was called, I have in my notes, the most generic title mashup ever, Super Time Force Ultra, where it was like every time you died, like it would create like a quote unquote new timeline. So similar to Braid, like you'd have like copies of yourselves doing the same shit. So like it was necessary though, if like some boss fights, you had to die a bunch of times so that your past selves would come back and then shooting it like 1,000 times. So like I thought it was pretty neat. So like it was similar-ish to Braid. It wasn't as complicated per se, but it was sort of like the general idea in vain. I thought they did it pretty well. Never actually finished it, but I did enjoy playing like through like 3 or 4 levels or whatever it was. And like even different characters and different like sort of like Lost Vikings plus Braid in a sense, right? Kind of. So it was a pretty neat idea, and I think they executed it pretty well. Let me just go back real quick because I do have one more. Again, a game that I enjoyed, but I don't think many people played. I don't think it sold well. It was called Singularity, and it was FPS, and the gimmick was it's like the most, again, generic is like time manipulation device or something like that. It's like the thing from fucking Future Man, like the time device. But you could like age and de-age both environmental things to like advance and do it to enemies. So like they just like de-age into like a fetus and explode, or like or like conversely like fucking Indiana Jones style, right. So that was a pretty neat mechanic, and of course it also had bullet time, which I'd also have like on my list of like things like Max Payne, Super Hot recently. I think did kind of a cool mechanic with time. You guys know about that?
No, I hadn't. Is that the one that was like primarily VR?
So like they did a VR version of it, but the first iteration was just a regular like FPS, but the conceit was it's all like polygons, so like polygon enemies, but when you move, they move, and when you stop, they stop.
Right.
So like you can get yourself in various positions and like you get like very limited shots or ammo. So like you have to get in position to kill one, get its ammo, and like set up yourself. But every time you're moving, they're moving and shooting at you too.
Yeah.
So like, that was a pretty good idea.
Like a puzzle. Like
yeah, almost kind of like that for sure.
Nice.
So like those are some of like the bigger ones that like used either the mechanics or time travel manipulation as a plot device, and sometimes both. So I think you might have had something that you wanted to bring up, E, that sort of surprised me.
Before we do that,
Okay.
I want to bring up another game. I just thought of it while you were talking.
Okay.
Nice. An early PS2 game. Shadows something, but what I forget the
Very
name.
generic again, yes.
No, it was actually a really neat idea.
Okay.
Is that
But generic titles,
where you're in like a European town and you're killed mysteriously, and when you awake, I believe it's Mephistopheles or some kind of
cool. Yeah.
golem type thing, allows you to go back in time and prevent your murder. And no matter what you do, though, it seems that like you're fated to die. So it keeps
interesting.
But it's one of the first games that I remember where time really, like they did time very well, almost like it was a small area that you could affect. But
as a concept,
you had representations to the ways you saved yourself.
Yeah, that's cool. I've never heard of it, or like not familiar with it, but interesting.
That's very cool. I'm trying to think of like other games, but nothing is coming to the top of my list.
Yeah,
we were mentioning before the cast, like Time Crisis, and which kind of use time in a different way than we've been talking about, but that's an interesting use as well, and like I think that certainly applies.
Now, this is where it gets interesting. Yes, that is in a strict sense, and what I initially thought this was about was games that had that.
I know it's a very broad concept, sure.
Count that. The problem is, it's so incredibly broad. For instance, any stealth game you play has time as a specific mechanic that you're working with, in the sense that you have, like, at this certain point, you do this action, and it's inserting yourself into the mechanism that they developed. So, I mean, depending on what you want to define time as, really.
Sure, of course. Yeah.
Maybe we should call it like time travel or time manipulation.
Sure, right? I mean, that's an unworldly, but that's what I was getting at. But it's funny.
But like those are the two things that like, we're really thinking of.
That's what I was thinking of. Yeah, that's what I was sort of envisioning it. But you're right, like
except for you, yeah.
Right? But I did have on my notes, like, of course, time is like such a broad concept that may or may not even exist in the reality that we experience. Right? You could make a joke of that.
It's a whole other podcast.
But yes, when we start a physics show, we'll talk about it.
Yeah.
But no, like it does bring me to like the other like bigger ish thing I had is that programming like physics engines and so forth to deal with, like there's say Unreal, or give any engine you want to, any like tool that they have to have like a standard baseline. Then you have to, you guys tell me this is what I was asking you, maybe UE specifically, but in order to have that mechanic or a mechanic like it, then I'm not sure. Wouldn't be able to tell you like how difficult or not it would be like to mess with the base programming of the physics engine to then allow it to like slow down or whatever, like manipulate it.
They've been doing bullet time ever since
Max Payne?
Yeah. No, the movie
Matrix, yeah.
Yeah, like that. After the Matrix, every game had to have bullet time in it.
Yeah, true. I'm just saying,
it's just interesting. I completely forgot about this, but there's a level in Conker's Bad Fur Day that is a Matrix level that you can do bullet time, and like that's a very cool level in that game. I remember playing it for N64, and like going through that level is a blast.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I don't know if I would still have fun with it. I'm sure
Conker's holds up.
Yeah. All right.
Oh, there you go.
Check it out.
But yeah, I'm saying is like I'm just not sure. Like I would like to ask a developer or programmer, like when you're working with whatever engine, like the baseline, how the physics are programmed into it. But when you have to allow for players to manipulate time, like yes, the Matrix had it, but I'm just saying it's a lot more complicated to me in an interactive medium like video games because you have to account for all the AI stuff and like reactionary stuff.
I don't think it like Max Payne is. We're talking about a game that was on a 64-bit Nintendo thing.
And can handle true.
Like, it's not
fair enough.
That difficult of manipulation to do it.
It was just something I thought of.
Here's what I think is more interesting: the storytelling aspect of dealing with being able to change the past, or it's very difficult to have that many options of free will, because video games are all about control. And you have a character. It's almost linear in the sense that they're in A and they have to get to B. How much leeway can
Do you
you
have
actually give
yeah.
to a player
Yeah.
to change?
That's a very good point. True. And I don't think like they've solved it really. Like, of course, like even again, Chrono Trigger itself, there's only really one way in quote to do it. It's just that they're sending you. It feels as if you have some freedom, but you can only really choose like either do this little side quest that changes the past/future or don't, and then the main plot like goes on as well. So like, yeah, I mean that's true. Like, there's one funny thing I was going to mention. I mean, not quite related, but when Assassin's Creed, the very first one, was coming out, so like there was no like that. Obviously, it was like the first one in the franchise, and I believe it was a very late Xbox 360 game. But either way, I thought the premise was I just remember hearing like time travel assassin. Like, oh, that's cool. So do I go all different time periods and like assassinate people? But like, it kind of was that, but not quite. Like, as a whole series, it is that. But the first game itself was just in one historical time period.
Right.
So like, and eventually, of course, like they had like characters in like the present day of the plot. But you're right, like it's always going to be the case, I think, narratively, and especially in games, to like integrate that in a way that makes sense or is satisfying, I guess, narratively, but also then allow you the gameplay that, again, like you don't have that aspect in any other medium.
Well, you know me, I'm not the biggest fan of Assassin's Creed, but I will give them credit on trying to do. Trying to represent all these different time periods. Although I think it would have been, now that you mention it, I think it would have been great if they just did a whole bunch of different time periods in like the first game.
That's what I thought it was going to be.
Off from there.
The problem is that Assassin's Creed has the buy your bootstraps problem. Is that everything you do in the past has already happened.
Yeah,
you're not changing anything about history. All you're doing is role playing.
Yeah, it's like here's the real way it happened because assassins were there, but it still happened the way it happened.
Yeah.
I mean that's a funny point, but that's true. Like essentially, that's the core of it when you get down to it.
Well, that's the second problem that you're talking about. Ian, I think, is talking about like in canon, the actions that your character is taking in the game have already happened, so you're just role playing those actions.
Yeah, no, that's true.
But you're talking
it's both
about,
actually.
Like,
you're right.
I love that too. Like, there's two layers of this, right?
Yeah.
Like, you're talking about like, oh, we're talking about an actual part of history that we're just inserting in it, like that this story is inserting an assassin into, and like so you have to kind of play by the rules of what happened in history to some degree.
Yeah,
and like
but
build your story and game around that.
But there's actually no reason for there to be the animus or anything like that. You can just have it take place as like playing that character.
The animus is the framework, but you're right. Like, well, here's your genetic or your what is it, like your ancestor did this, so you have to do it that way too. Like, so we're railroading you both ways essentially. Mm-hmm. But no, that is a funny point. But I'm just saying, like, I expected it. That's what I thought it was going to be when it came out. But I'm trying to think of any other games I have in here that, like, again, certainly I'm missing a few, but these are like the ones we mentioned, the bigger ones, or the ones that at least I was more familiar with and remember that utilize it. But like you said, I do agree with you guys. It's a bit of a nebulous concept, and I don't think it's like as used, I guess, possibly because it's problematic to work with, both narratively and to a lesser degree, if not then like mechanically, at least how to smartly integrate it so that it makes sense and not like annoying or like frustrating to play.
Right. It's just a difficult story element to manipulate because you have to be aware of all the elements of your plot at all times, because you could be changing something that has far-reaching effects. Like, right, normally when you write a story, it's like, okay, this can only change what happens in the future. But now you can be making something that changes what happens to something that you've already written, right? Like, theoretically.
Then you write yourself into a hole or a wall or something. But I mean, of course.
Which I think is the fascinating thing about writing about like time travel or like
it's always
time
tricky.
Manipulation elements. And like that's why I really like this concept and this topic, is because that there is that it gets so complicated and that's where. And like in that complication, that's where it gets interesting if you can manipulate it correctly. Like the best storytellers do this really well, where they seed something early on that maybe doesn't make sense or like doesn't necessarily seem correct, but later actions make sense. And if you manipulate time correctly in the story that you're telling, like that is such a powerful tool to tell your story in a very different way than most like standard stories happen.
No, you're right.
Why I really like that aspect, and why I really like, as somebody who sometimes tries to write stories, hate trying to do that because it's infuriatingly frustrating.
Sure, you're right. It's difficult, and like it's always going to be difficult. But I think perhaps this medium, like especially, has more hurdles than even like more traditional ones, or writing a book or a movie or a story. We'll say. But I actually just thought of one. This is a game I didn't play, but it was called Quantum Break or Quantic Break or something like that. Where I believe the conceit was you're like two characters who can travel back and forth in like brief periods and change something. So I don't know, like certainly that was the mechanic and the plot, but I don't know like how well, I can't speak to how well or not it was done, but it just popped in my head while you guys I was thinking about it. But hey, if anybody's out there played it, let me know if it's worth it or not. But there's one other thing. I believe I may have mentioned it on the E3 episode, but Remedy, the studio who did Alan Wake, which is a game I love, their next one is going to be called Control, and I believe it's like they're calling it like under the new weird like style of stuff, so like paranormal stuff, but I believe time manipulation is supposed to be part of it, like at least to some degree, is like what you'll be doing with, or like having again the mechanics / abilities to do so during the plot of the game. But they've only showed out a little bit of it. Like some news just came out this week, but I believe it does contain some element of it.
Nice.
And that seems cool. So yeah, like you're right. Like I said, there's probably certainly a number of titles that I missed or just didn't mention that use it. But just as a conceit, yeah, it can be difficult, especially narratively. But certainly we named some of the ones that did it well, or just again like even as you mentioned, Turtles in Time. Like just use it as a framework. Like hey, again, let's have a mission on an old Western train, and and like now in a space station or whatever.
So like. Here's an interesting thing. Ian, I know you have something that you're gonna talk about. So, like, just before you get into that, I thought you had a topic that you wanted to discuss. Did we already do that?
Yes, we did.
Yeah, I thought that was it. I was going to say yes.
I thought we were gonna do that. All right,
it's okay. What do you got?
So here's something else, right? Like everything, every story, right? Every plot, every narrative has, like, whether or not they acknowledge it, time is like an integral part of it.
Sure, like by default.
Just in how the story unfolds. So that being said, thinking about, and I'm doing this on the fly, so I apologize for how broken this might be.
Sure.
Whatever, but
give me the core elevator pitch.
That being said, what are the elements that you have to kind of, or that creators have to acknowledge as they're running a game, like any game, right? Like, not only do you have to tell your story, like as a writer or a script writer or whatever, but like you have to acknowledge the way that your player
can experiences
the game, right? Like,
sure,
you know, so
that's true.
That, like, time is always something you have to acknowledge and understand, and like, so if you're writing a book, or if you're writing a comic, or if you're writing a video game, it's all kind of the same, right? Like, where you have to say, like, all right, so this player or reader or whatever is going to experience this at the pace that
this juncture
decide. Usually video games are a little bit different because the player can play it at whatever pace they really want to, but as the writer, you are trying to guide them to your pace, right? Like,
sure, I see what you're saying.
So like, what are the things that you have to be thinking about, like, as a creator, in terms of like the pacing of your game? And like, I think that plays a lot into the time, the narrative of time, right? Like, as we're talking about this, and granted, this is kind of like a reach. It's not like exactly in what you wanted to talk about, but this is something that I was thinking about as we were talking about this.
I think he's going to address it.
Okay, so video games are inherently about providing the illusion of control.
Mm-hmm.
Some games less so. First-person shooters. This much damage will kill this enemy. All that. But that's nowadays a lot behind the scenes, especially when you're dealing with time travel and choice and repercussions through different time periods. You have to, and this is one of the things that I'm going to actually reference Chrono Trigger here. Chrono Trigger actually made me believe that I impacted different time
events.
periods.
Yeah.
And I think one of the great things they did about it was there was a lot of optional things that I could have done that I didn't need to.
Yes, that's true.
There was the core
point.
narrative that I had to play out.
Yeah.
But there's also things like, oh, if I...
like the robo in the forest thing comes to mind for one of the side things.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Or the Black Omen.
Yes. Yeah.
You can actually defeat that multiple times by
Going
defeating it different.
Yeah, backwards through it. Yeah.
So I also believe I saw a little bit of singularity where it actually, from what I understand, you felt like like things you did affect other time periods.
That's true.
And that's where that's again, as I brought up earlier, why Life is Strange I think failed is that I felt that any choice I made towards the end didn't matter.
Was kind of yeah.
And thus,
So it failed to impart that sort of sensation.
exactly. I think that's the main drive of a game developer is to impart the fact that you are affecting not only your world but the world on multiple levels.
I mean, that's a really good point.
Would you say that's the point of developing a game, no matter what the storyline is, like whether or not it
to a degree, sure,
whether
but
or not it relates to time travel or whatever, like time manipulation or whatever.
But if you're thinking you're just working on one axis in a linear game, in a sense, where this is working on multiple axes of because you have to go back to places and see how things have changed.
Yeah, exactly. That's a really good point, and I think you're right. Like, yeah, that is more of a consideration, and when handled well, it's going to feel as if it's more organic, I guess, or natural, right? As if you participated rather than like, well, they're clearly railroading me, or like I did this one thing, but it was moot in the end because it didn't seem to have any effect on the game world within itself. Yeah, that's a really good point, and good question for sure.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of the. I mean that's really interesting. What you just said is like, you know, these games. And I guess that's kind of what I was trying to drive at, right? Like, it's like, what are the developers trying to do, and are they successful at it, right? Like, are they trying to get me to consider time and the way that it's used? Like, a lot of times I feel like, in like a straightforward game, we'll say, the developers are trying to get you to not be aware of time, right? Like, what's the reason that you don't go stand in a corner in a game, right? It's because there's something much more interesting to do not in that corner, right?
Sure, yeah.
It's, you know.
Yeah.
But in these games, they kind of flip the script and they're like, hey, acknowledge time, understand it, and if it's done well, like, realize what your actions are doing to this game, but also what your actions are doing to the way that you view the time that you're spending in this game. And I think that's really cool.
Yeah, well said.
To go back to SNS RPGs for a moment. So I played a number of them where after you leave like the initial town, you ever go back there for some reason, like they're giving the same dialogue.
Yeah.
With that. Whereas again, in Chrono Trigger, when the Black Omen appears,
people are like, the Omen looks great today. Like, because to them, I remember that. Because to them, it's been there forever because of you actions in the past, for sure. No, it's a really good point. And like, that's all very interesting. Like, yeah, good job. Like, something I didn't actually consider, but something that was sort of, you guys did a perfect job because something, I hope something like that was going to arise from this in a sense. And I'll just sort of maybe close off with one thing. It's not quite what you're saying, but since you guys are probably sick of hearing it, but maybe some listeners aren't quite yet, but I've been playing a lot of Spider-Man, of course, the new one.
Yes.
And so like the cool thing, like it's a minor thing, but for example, as you advance the story quests, there's no day-night cycle unless you until you hit like a certain point in the story. So like it starts off on dusk, and then you go to like the next day, and then the next one is like night. So like each one will change like what time it is in the city. But that means like also, of course, since open world, like knowing me, like after the first mission or two, when it gave me the reins, I just did like all this side stuff, like
eternal day,
essentially on the same the same like dusk time. Like it's like, it's always funny, but like some games will do that too. Like GTA sometimes does it, or like certain missions, like because they want it to be cinematic, of course. It's like, oh, they're looking a lot cooler at night if you do this mission, or a lot cooler like at dawn or whatever.
Be a lot cooler if you did.
But it does, like, a lot cooler if it was dawn. But like this made me think of what you said. Like they want you to sort of, when done well, you won't notice the passage of time, or they're using it for like actively to some kind of effect. So just made me think of that as all.
The Soulsborne games do that really well as well.
Yeah, good point. That's true.
Just a little aside.
No, shit changes as
Because
well.
I always have to talk about the
No,
animation.
I feel you, but you're right. Like from what I know, from what I played, they will integrate like changes like that and reflect it in the environment of the world.
Especially Bloodborne does it really well.
For sure. So yeah, time, interesting concept, and could be really cool sometimes when they do it in video games, and when it's not, you're gonna fucking notice it. You're gonna be like, that was terrible.
Fun to talk
Didn't
about.
make any sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that'll do it. Any thoughts on time in video games? Parentheses.
No, but I'll come back again and have something good.
Okay. Well, I will say as a PSA, this is probably the last official episode of Games and Games Culture for this season. We'll do one final special as we normally do for Halloween on horror games, and then we'll return again next spring.
Mm-hmm.
All right. That'll be the time in which to catch us. Other than that, I, of course, will be slipping through the time machine myself, Scott Thurlow, and I've been here with Jonathan Ian Manzer.
The future refused to change.
Nice. And Steven Amosi.
Remember me.
Good night. We'll see you next time. Thank you for joining the Lost Signals Games and Gaming Culture. Check us out on YouTube and iTunes for the shows and more, and on Facebook and Twitter for updates.